Picture this. You're shivering under 3 blankets, your heater humming in the background, and you still can't get warm. Now imagine doing that same thing 40,000 years ago, when winter meant survival, not just discomfort. But here's what might surprise you. Our ancient ancestors, Neanderthals, early humans, the people we dismissively call cavemen, they didn't just survive those brutal Ice Age winters. They thrived. They slept peacefully through nights that would break most of us in hours. Tonight, as you settle into your comfortable bed, I want to take you on a journey. We're going back to a time when staying warm wasn't about adjusting a thermostat. It was about mastering the ancient art of winter sleep. When getting through the night meant the difference between seeing another sunrise or becoming another casualty of the endless cold. These weren't primitive people stumbling through the darkness. They were engineers of comfort, architects of warmth, masters of the most important skill humans have ever learned: how to rest safely in a hostile world. From the mammoth bone palaces of Siberia to the heated caves of ancient Spain, from the ingenious snow shelters of the Arctic tundra to the carefully planned sleeping arrangements that kept entire families alive. We're about to discover secrets that might just change how you think about your own sleep. So pull your covers a little tighter, maybe turn down the lights, and let's explore how our ancestors turned the world's most dangerous season into the most peaceful sleep they'd ever know. Chapter 1: The Cold Truth. Picture this. You're shivering under 3 blankets, your heater humming in the background, and you still can't get warm. Now imagine doing that same thing 40,000 years ago, when winter meant survival, not just discomfort. But here's what might surprise you. Our ancient ancestors, Neanderthals, early humans, the people we dismissively call cavemen, they didn't just survive those brutal Ice Age winters. They thrived. They slept peacefully through nights that would break most of us in hours. Tonight, as you settle into your comfortable bed, I want to take you on a journey. We're going back to a time when staying warm wasn't about adjusting a thermostat. It was about mastering the ancient art of winter sleep. When getting through the night meant the difference between seeing another sunrise or becoming another casualty of the endless cold. These weren't primitive people stumbling through the darkness. They were engineers of comfort, architects of warmth, masters of the most important skill humans have ever learned: how to rest safely in a hostile world. From the mammoth bone palaces of Siberia to the heated caves of ancient Spain, from the ingenious snow shelters of the Arctic tundra to the carefully planned sleeping arrangements that kept entire families alive, we're about to discover secrets that might just change how you think about your own sleep. So pull your covers a little, pull your tighter, maybe turn down the lights, and let's explore how our ancestors turned the world's most dangerous season into the most peaceful sleep they'd ever know. The Ice Age wasn't just cold. It was a killing cold. The kind that turned your breath into ice crystals before it left your mouth, where exposed skin could freeze solid in minutes, and the wind cut through everything like a blade made of winter itself. Imagine stepping outside on the coldest day you've ever experienced. Now multiply that by 10. That was spring weather for our ancestors. Winter was something else entirely, a test of everything humans had learned about staying alive. But here's the remarkable thing. In places like Shanidar Cave in Iraq, archaeologists have found evidence of Neanderthal families who lived through winter after winter, not just surviving, but creating spaces so comfortable that children grew up healthy and strong. Elders lived to pass on their knowledge. Families stayed together through months of darkness that should have scattered them to the winds. They had no electric blankets, no central heating, No insulated walls or double-pane windows. What they had was something far more powerful. The accumulated wisdom of thousands of generations who had figured out how to sleep peacefully while the world outside tried to kill them. Every technique they developed, every small innovation in shelter design or bedding arrangement, was paid for with the lives of those who got it wrong. The knowledge we're about to explore wasn't written in books or passed down through stories alone. It was carved into human DNA through the simple truth that those who slept well lived to have children, and those who didn't became part of the ice. And the most beautiful part? They didn't just endure these nights. They found comfort in them. Joy, even. Because when you've mastered the art of staying warm in a world that never stops trying to freeze you, the simple act of closing your eyes becomes a victory worth celebrating. So as we begin this journey together, remember that every warm bed you've ever slept in, every peaceful night you've ever enjoyed, owes its existence to people who learned to sleep like babies while the Ice Age raged around them. The secrets they discovered are about to change everything you thought you knew about rest, comfort, and what it really means to feel safe in the dark. Chapter 2. Masters of Fire wasn't just light and heat to our Ice Age ancestors. It was life itself, captured and tamed. But keeping fire alive through a brutal winter night, that was an art form that took generations to perfect. Picture the scene. Outside, the wind is howling so hard it makes your bones ache just listening to it. Snow is piling up against your shelter walls, and the temperature has dropped so low that water would freeze solid in seconds. Inside, a small flame dances in the darkness, and somehow, miraculously, everyone is warm enough to sleep. That miracle didn't happen by accident. It was the result of techniques so sophisticated that modern survival experts are still learning from them today. The first secret was choosing the right fuel. Not all wood burns the same way, and in the Ice Age, getting it wrong meant waking up to cold ashes and the very real possibility of not waking up at all. They learned that hardwoods like oak and beech burned slow and steady, throwing off heat for hours without needing constant attention. Softwoods like pine caught fire quickly, but burned out fast, useful for starting a fire, deadly for maintaining one through the night. But in many places, wood was scarce or non-existent. The treeless tundra stretched for hundreds of miles, broken only by the occasional stunted bush. So they got creative. Animal dung, dried and aged, became fuel. Bone marrow burned with a clean, steady flame. Even dried peat, cut from marshy areas and stored through the summer, could keep a fire going all night long. The real mastery, though, was in the technique called banking. Just before the last person settled down for sleep, they would carefully arrange the coals. Not scattered randomly, but in a precise pattern that would hold heat while using the minimum amount of fuel. They'd cover the glowing embers with a thin layer of ash, not enough to smother the fire, but just enough to slow it down, making it burn like a slow heartbeat through the night. Then came the stones. Large, dense rocks were heated in the fire during the evening, then carefully moved to strategic positions around the sleeping area. These thermal batteries would release their stored heat for hours, long after the flames had died down to barely glowing coals. Position them wrong, and you'd wake up with burns. Position them right, and you'd sleep through the coldest night in perfect comfort. But perhaps the most ingenious technique was the reflector system. They would build their fires near rock walls or construct barriers of stacked stones behind the flames. This bounced the heat back toward the sleeping area, effectively doubling the warmth from the same amount of fuel. Some sites show evidence of carefully arranged stone circles designed to capture and redirect every precious bit of heat. The smoke was managed too. They learned to position their fires so the smoke would drift through the sleeping area, not enough to choke anyone, but just enough to kill insects and create a protective barrier against pests. Certain plants thrown into the flames would produce smoke that repelled mosquitoes and flies, turning a potential problem into another layer of comfort. Fire placement was an exact science. Too close to the bedding, and you risked burns or accidentally setting hides ablaze. Too far away, and the heat wouldn't reach where it was needed. The sweet spot was usually about 6 feet from the main sleeping area, close enough to feel the warmth, far enough to stay safe. And then there was the matter of airflow. Fire needs oxygen to burn, but too much draft could make the flames leap unpredictably or blow smoke in the wrong direction. They learned to create subtle wind channels using strategically placed rocks or hide screens, guiding fresh air to the fire while protecting sleepers from direct drafts. The most skilled firekeepers could judge exactly how much fuel would be needed for the entire night. They'd prepare bundles of kindling, stack larger pieces in precise order, and even pre-position tomorrow's fire-starting materials so that relighting a dead fire wouldn't require fumbling around in the dark. But here's what makes this truly remarkable. They did all of this without thermometers, without weather forecasts, without any modern tools. They rid the fire like we read books. The color of the flames told them about the fuel quality. The way smoke moved revealed air pressure changes that might signal weather shifts. The sound of burning wood indicated moisture content and burning efficiency. A master fire tender could look at a flame and know exactly how long it would burn, how hot it would get, and what adjustments were needed. They could feel the heat with their hands and determine whether the sleeping area would stay comfortable until dawn. This wasn't guesswork, it was precision, born from necessity. And when the fire was perfectly banked, the stones properly positioned, and the smoke drifting in just the right direction, something magical happened. The sleeping area became a pocket of Mediterranean warmth in an Arctic wasteland. Children could sleep without shivers. Adults could rest deeply enough to dream. Even in the heart of an Ice Age winter, fire made it possible to sleep like a baby. But fire alone wasn't enough. To truly master winter sleep, they needed to build the perfect shelter around that precious flame. Chapter 3: The Architecture of Warmth. The shelters our ancestors built weren't just places to hide from the wind. They were thermal engineering marvels that could keep a family warm for months using nothing but materials they found lying around. Forget everything you think you know about primitive construction. These people were architects working with the toughest client in history, winter itself. And winter doesn't accept compromise. In the frozen steppes of what's now Ukraine and Russia, they built structures that would make modern engineers weep with envy. Picture this: a framework made entirely from mammoth bones. Not just any bones, but carefully selected femurs, ribs, and tusks, fitted together like pieces of a three-dimensional puzzle that had been perfected over centuries. The base was a circle of mammoth skulls, each one weighing hundreds of pounds, placed with geometric precision. These formed the foundation, solid, stable, and already providing the first layer of insulation from the frozen ground. Rising from this base, massive leg bones were angled inward to form a dome-like framework. The whole structure was held together, not with nails or rope, but with the ancient engineer's best friend, ice. Water poured over the joints would freeze almost instantly, creating connections stronger than any modern adhesive. But that was just the skeleton. The real genius was in the walls. Layer upon layer of animal hides were stretched over the bone framework. But not randomly. there was a specific order. The innermost layer was made from the softest, most flexible skins, creating a comfortable interior wall. The middle layers used thicker hides for insulation, and the outermost covering was made from the toughest, most weather-resistant skins available: mammoth hide, bison, or cave bear. Between these layers, they stuffed dried grasses, moss, even feathers when they could find them. This created an insulation system that worked exactly like modern down jackets, trapping warm air in thousands of tiny pockets. The whole structure became a thermal barrier so effective that inside temperatures could be 40 or 50 degrees warmer than outside. But the really clever part was the entrance. Instead of a simple doorway, they created an airlock system, a tunnel-like entry that curved downward before rising into the main living space. Cold air, being heavier than warm air, would settle in this entrance tunnel instead of flowing into the sleeping area. It was like having a built-in heating system that worked on pure physics. In areas with natural caves, they didn't just move in, they remodeled. Evidence from sites across Europe shows that they modified cave entrances, building partial walls to control airflow and heat retention. They'd narrow wide openings to reduce heat loss, or expand small ones to improve ventilation. Some caves show signs of having had multiple chambers carved out, creating separate areas for sleeping, food storage, and workspace. The sleeping areas were always positioned deepest in the cave, where the Earth's natural temperature provided a stable baseline warmth. They'd excavate shallow depressions in the cave floor, creating sleeping nooks that trapped warm air like natural basins. These depressions were then lined with carefully layered materials: stones on the bottom for thermal mass, dried vegetation for insulation, and finally the softest hides for comfort. But what about places without caves or mammoth bones? They got even more creative. In forested areas, they built lean-to shelters against large trees or rock formations. But these weren't simple camping structures. They were sophisticated buildings designed for long-term winter habitation. The framework started with a main ridgepole, either a fallen tree or a carefully selected branch, positioned at an angle that would shed snow while maximizing interior space. Supporting poles were arranged in a pattern that distributed weight evenly, preventing collapse under heavy snow loads. The angles weren't random. They were calculated to create the maximum internal volume with the minimum surface area, reducing heat loss. The covering was a masterpiece of layering. First came a base layer of tightly woven branches, creating a solid shell. Over this went layers of bark, peeled in large sheets and overlapped like roof shingles to shed water. Then came the hide coverings, multiple layers with the hair side facing inward for maximum insulation. The floor construction was just as sophisticated. They'd dig down about a foot, removing the surface soil and any organic matter that might rot or attract pests. The depression was then filled with carefully sized stones, creating a thermal mass that would absorb heat during the day and release it slowly at night. Over the stones went layers of dried vegetation, then woven mats, and finally, the sleeping hides. Some shelters even had chimneys. Not the brick and mortar kind we're familiar with, but carefully constructed openings that allowed smoke to escape while preventing heat loss. They'd create a small opening at the highest point of the shelter, sometimes extended with a tube made from hollowed bones or rolled hides that drew smoke out through natural convection while keeping the heat inside. The attention to detail was extraordinary. They'd caulk gaps between hides with a mixture of clay and organic materials. They'd position reflector stones inside the shelter to bounce firelight and heat into darker corners. They'd even install simple but effective door systems, hide flaps weighted with stones that would automatically seal shut against drafts. And in the most sophisticated examples, they created what we'd now call central heating systems. In some mammoth bone houses, archaeologists have found evidence of multiple fire pits connected by carefully dug channels. Heat from a central fire could flow through these underground passages, warming the entire structure from below. These weren't temporary camping shelters. These were homes designed to last entire winters, and in some cases, to be used year after year. Some sites show evidence of continuous occupation for decades, with structures being repaired, modified, and improved over generations. The result? Interiors so comfortable that families could live in relative luxury while outside. The Ice Age winter raged in all its deadly fury. Children could sleep naked under furs. Adults could work on detailed tasks requiring fine motor control. Elders could survive cold snaps that would kill them in minutes if they were exposed. But even the most perfect shelter was only as good as what you put inside it to sleep on. Chapter 4. Snow as your best friend. Here's something that would sound crazy to anyone who hasn't lived through a real winter. Snow saved lives. Not by melting into drinking water or providing a pretty backdrop, but by becoming one of the most effective insulation materials our ancestors ever discovered. Think about it. You're trapped in a blizzard. The wind is howling. And everywhere you look, there's nothing but white death piling up around you. Your first instinct is to get away from the snow, to find shelter from it. But our Ice Age ancestors learned to do the exact opposite. They learned to sleep inside it. Snow is nature's version of foam insulation. Each flake is essentially a tiny crystal structure filled with trapped air. When billions of these structures pile up together, they create one of the most effective thermal barriers on Earth. The key is understanding that it's not the ice crystals keeping you warm. It's the air trapped between them. They discovered this truth through necessity. Picture a small group caught in a sudden storm, miles from their regular winter shelter. The wind is driving snow horizontally. Visibility is zero, and the temperature is dropping fast. Staying above ground means death. So they do something that seems insane. They dig down into the snow itself. The first step was finding the right type of snow. Not all snow works the same way. Fresh powder, the kind that falls straight down in calm air, is too loose and unstable. It won't hold its shape. Hard-packed snow, compressed by wind or repeated freezing and thawing, is too dense. It doesn't trap enough air to insulate properly. The perfect snow was aged powder that had settled for a few days, firm enough to excavate without collapsing, but still light enough to retain its insulating properties. You could tell the right consistency by touch. It would compress slightly under pressure, but spring back when released. The excavation technique was precise. They dig not just a hole, but a carefully engineered shelter. The entrance would be lower than the sleeping area, creating a cold trap where heavy, frigid air would settle instead of flowing into the living space. The sleeping chamber would be dome-shaped, the strongest architectural form, able to support tremendous weight while using the minimum amount of material. The walls had to be thick enough to provide insulation, but not so thick that they'd collapse inward. Experience taught them that 18 inches was usually the minimum safe thickness. Thinner walls couldn't support the weight of snow above. Thicker walls took too long to excavate and used up precious energy. But the real genius was in the finishing work. They'd polish the interior walls with their hands or tools, creating a smooth, slightly glazed surface. Body heat would cause the innermost layer of snow to melt just slightly, then refreeze into a thin shell of ice. This created an interior surface that was both waterproof and reflective, bouncing their body heat back at them instead of letting it soak into the snow. The sleeping platform was always raised above the entrance level. Warm air rises, so by creating this elevation difference, they turned physics into a heating system. Cold air would flow down and out through the entrance, while warm air would pool in the sleeping area. The temperature difference between the entrance and sleeping level could be 20 degrees or more. Inside these snow shelters, something remarkable happened. Even when outside temperatures dropped to -30 or -40 degrees Fahrenheit, the interior would stabilize at just below freezing, around 30 degrees. That might not sound warm, but when you're wrapped in furs and generating body heat, the difference between -40 and +30 is the difference between life and death. The acoustics were incredible too. Snow absorbs sound, so the interior of a snow shelter was almost completely silent. No wind noise, no cracking ice, no howling storms, just the quiet sound of breathing and the occasional whisper of conversation. For people used to the constant noise of ice age weather, this silence was probably as comforting as the warmth. They learned to work with snow's properties in other ways too. Snow walls could be built around existing shelters, piled up against the sides like giant snowdrifts. This added an extra layer of insulation around bone or hide structures, sometimes increasing interior temperatures by 10 or 15 degrees. In areas with deep, stable snow, they'd dig tunnel networks connecting multiple shelters. Families could visit each other, share resources, or evacuate from one shelter to another without ever exposing themselves to the surface weather. Some of these tunnel systems were surprisingly extensive. Archaeologists have found evidence of networks covering several hundred yards. The tools for snow construction were simple but effective. Flat pieces of bone or wood served as shovels. Curved bones could shape walls and smooth surfaces. Even something as simple as a stick could be used to poke ventilation holes or test wall thickness. Ventilation was crucial. Snow shelters are nearly airtight, which means they can trap not just warm air, but also carbon dioxide from breathing. They learned to poke small holes near the ceiling to allow gas exchange while preventing significant heat loss. The holes had to be just the right size. Too small, and they'd plug up with ice. Too large, and they'd let out too much heat. They even learned to furnish their snow homes. Shelves could be carved into the walls to hold tools or food. Sleeping benches could be shaped from the snow itself, then covered with hides and furs. Some elaborate snow shelters had multiple rooms, sleeping areas, storage areas, even workshop spaces where they could repair gear while staying warm. But perhaps the most impressive thing about snow shelter construction was how quickly they could build them. An experienced team could excavate a shelter large enough for several people in just a few hours. When you're caught in a blizzard and losing body heat fast, that speed could mean the difference between survival and death. And when morning came, or the storm passed, they could simply abandon the shelter without a trace. Unlike bone and hide structures that took days to build and pack up, snow shelters could be left behind without wasting any materials. The next storm would fill them in, and it would be as if they'd never existed. This wasn't just emergency survival. It was a complete building technology that let them thrive in conditions that would kill most modern humans in hours. They turned winter's deadliest weapon into their most comfortable bedroom. But the most comfortable bedroom in the world won't keep you alive if you don't know how to dress it properly. Chapter 5. The Art of Layering. Imagine trying to stay warm all night, using nothing but what you could skin, stuff, or weave from your environment. No synthetic materials, no down from specially bred ducks, no electric blankets, just fur, hide, grass, and whatever else the Ice Age world had to offer. And not only staying warm, but sleeping so comfortably that you'd wake up rested and ready for another day of survival. Our ancestors turned bedding into a science. Every layer had a purpose, every material had its place, and the difference between a good night's sleep and freezing to death often came down to understanding exactly how to stack these materials in the right order. The foundation of any good Ice Age bed was thermal mass. This meant rocks, but not just any rocks. They needed stones that could absorb a lot of heat without cracking when heated and cooled repeatedly. River rocks were perfect because they'd been naturally tested by countless freeze-thaw cycles. Sandstone and limestone worked well too. What they avoided were rocks like shale or slate that would split apart explosively when heated. During the day, these stones would be heated in the fire until they were almost too hot to touch. Then, as evening approached, they'd be carefully wrapped in hides or grass bundles and placed throughout the sleeping area. Larger stones went around the perimeter to create a warm zone. Smaller stones could be tucked directly into the bedding, moving heat sources that would radiate warmth for hours. The technique for handling hot stones was an art in itself. Too hot, and they'd burn through hides or scorch anyone who rolled onto them. Not hot enough, and they'd cool down before providing enough benefit. They learned to test stone temperature by holding their hands at specific distances, techniques that were probably passed down from parent to child like family recipes. Above the stones went the first layer of organic insulation. This was usually dried grass, but not just any grass. The best material was long stem grass that had been cut at just the right stage of growth, mature enough to be sturdy, but not so old that it would break down into dust. Prairie grass, sedge grass, even reeds from marshy areas could work. The grass was prepared carefully. It had to be completely dry to prevent rot and mold, but not so brittle that it would crumble under weight. They'd often bind it into loose bundles or weave it into mats that could be layered like organic mattresses. The grass layer needed to be thick enough to provide cushioning and insulation, but not so thick that the stone's heat couldn't penetrate through to the sleeping level. In some regions, they used other plant materials. Moss, when available, made excellent insulation because it naturally trapped air in its structure. Pine needles, particularly from fir trees, not only insulated but released aromatic compounds that repelled insects and may have had mild antiseptic properties. In tundra areas, they might use dried lichens or even layers of animal fur that had been shed naturally. The next layer was where things got sophisticated. This was typically a barrier layer made from specially prepared hides. Not the thick, heavy hides used for outer coverings, but thinner, more flexible skins that had been processed to be water-resistant while remaining breathable. These prevented moisture from sweat or breath from soaking down into the plant materials below, while still allowing air circulation. These barrier hides were often made from animals like deer or reindeer, whose skin could be processed into a leather that was both tough and supple. The preparation process involved careful scraping to remove all fat and meat, then treatment with natural tanning agents, sometimes brain matter from the animal itself, sometimes plant-based compounds like oak bark extract. Above the barrier layer came the sleeping surface, the materials that would actually touch their bodies. This layer had to balance several needs. It had to be soft enough for comfort, insulating enough to trap body heat, and durable enough to withstand nightly use for months at a time. The finest sleeping surfaces were made from the softest furs available. Arctic fox, with its incredibly dense coat, was prized when available. Rabbit fur was common and effective. Multiple rabbit hides sewn together could create a sleeping surface that was both warm and relatively lightweight. In some areas, they used bird feathers and down, either stuffed into hide bags to make primitive pillows and cushions, or sewn directly between layers of hide to create puffy, insulated sleeping pads. But the real mastery showed in how they arranged these materials. Different people needed different configurations. Adults could handle firmer, less insulated bedding because they generated more body heat. Children and elderly individuals needed extra layers and softer surfaces. Pregnant women required specific arrangements that would keep them warm while allowing them to shift positions comfortably. The edges of the sleeping area were always built up higher than the center, creating a nest-like depression that would trap warm air around the sleepers. This wasn't accidental. Warm air rises, but if you can create physical barriers that prevent it from escaping horizontally, you can build up a pocket of heated air that surrounds you like a cocoon. They also understood the principle of layering for adjustability. Instead of one thick, heavy covering, they used multiple thinner layers that could be added or removed as temperatures changed through the night. A warm evening might require only a single light fur covering. A bitter cold night might need 4 or 5 layers, carefully arranged so each one trapped additional air without compressing the layers below. Personal bedding was often customized. A hunter might prefer firmer support for muscles strained from long days of tracking. A toolmaker might need softer cushioning for hands and arms worn out from detailed work. Mothers nursing infants needed bedding arranged to allow them to feed children without exposing either of them to cold air. The maintenance of this bedding system was constant. Hides needed regular cleaning and treatment to prevent them from becoming stiff or developing odors that might attract predators. Plant materials had to be replaced periodically as they compressed and lost their insulating properties. Stones required reheating and repositioning. They even developed storage systems for off-season bedding. Furs would be carefully cleaned, treated with pest-repelling compounds, and stored in dry locations where rodents and insects couldn't get to them. The best grass and plant materials might be bundled and cached in locations where they could be retrieved when the group returned to the same winter site. What they created was more than just a place to sleep. It was a microenvironment where temperatures could be controlled within a few degrees, where moisture was managed to prevent both dampness and excessive dryness, and where every person could find the specific combination of warmth and comfort their body needed. The result was sleep quality that might surprise modern people. Deep, restorative rest in conditions that should have made sleep impossible. But even the most perfectly crafted bed was only as good as the human heating system it contained. Chapter 6. Body Heat Economics. The human body is a walking furnace that burns about 2,000 calories a day and converts a significant portion of that energy into heat. But in Ice Age, winter conditions, managing that heat output became a matter of life and death, not just for individuals, but for entire groups. Our ancestors discovered something that modern science has only recently begun to understand. The strategic arrangement of human bodies can create thermal efficiencies that no technology can match. They turned group sleeping into a precision science where every person's position mattered. Think of it as human engineering. Each adult body produces roughly 100 watts of heat, about the same as a bright incandescent light bulb. But unlike a light bulb, humans generate more heat when they're relaxed and sleeping well, and less heat when they're stressed or shivering. The trick was arranging people so that everyone's heat output was maximized and everyone's heat loss was minimized. The basic formation was elegant in its simplicity, a loose circle with the most heat-vulnerable people in the center. But the execution was far more complex than just huddling together, randomly. Children were always placed at the core, not just because they needed protection, but because they had the highest surface area to body mass ratio, meaning they lost heat fastest. A child placed at the edge of a sleeping group might lose body heat faster than they could generate it, leading to hypothermia even under furs. But surrounded by adult bodies, they could maintain stable temperatures while contributing their own heat to the group's thermal pool. Elderly individuals were positioned next to the children, but with specific considerations. While they needed extra warmth, they also often had the lightest sleep and could serve as natural sentries, waking at the first sign of problems with the fire or threats from outside. Their positioning near the center kept them warm while allowing them to respond quickly to emergencies. Adults were arranged based on their heat output and sleep patterns. The best heat producers, typically young, healthy men, were positioned where they could warm the maximum number of people. Someone who naturally ran warm might sleep between two people who tended to get cold. Someone with a lower metabolism might be positioned next to a higher heat producer. But this wasn't random placement. Families sleeping together night after night would learn each person's thermal characteristics. They'd know who kicked off covers when they got too warm, who curled up tightly when cold, who moved around a lot during sleep, and who slept motionlessly. This knowledge let them optimize arrangements for maximum comfort and warmth. The spacing was critical too. Bodies too close together would create hot spots and pressure points that made comfortable sleep impossible. Bodies too far apart would leave cold gaps where heat could escape. The optimal distance seemed to be just close enough that body heat could radiate from one person to another, but far enough apart that people could shift positions without disturbing their neighbors. They developed techniques for what we might call thermal bridging. A person sleeping between two others didn't just benefit from their heat. They could actually transfer warmth from the person who was running warmer to the person who was getting cold. Human bodies became living heat exchangers, balancing the group's temperature automatically throughout the night. Pregnant women required special arrangements. Their increased metabolism made them excellent heat sources, but they also needed freedom to move and change positions. They were often positioned where their extra heat could benefit children or elderly individuals, while being surrounded by people who could shift to accommodate their changing comfort needs. Sick or injured individuals needed customized positioning too. Someone with a fever might be placed where their extra heat could benefit others, but with easy access to cooler air if they became overheated. Someone with an injury that made movement difficult would be positioned where they could stay warm without needing to shift positions frequently. The group's thermal management extended beyond just positioning. They learned to coordinate their sleep schedules for optimal heat retention. As some people entered deeper sleep phases and their body temperature dropped slightly, others would be in lighter sleep phases with higher heat output, maintaining the group's overall thermal balance. They even managed group breathing patterns. When people sleep close together, their breathing tends to synchronize naturally, but they may have deliberately encouraged this because synchronized breathing creates more stable air currents and humidity levels within the sleeping space. The warm, humid air from multiple people breathing together created a microclimate that was significantly more comfortable than individual sleeping. Clothing management was part of the system too. Too many clothes while sleeping in a group could lead to overheating and dangerous sweating. Too few could mean losing body heat too quickly if the group's thermal balance was disrupted. They learned to layer clothing so it could be adjusted throughout the night, without fully waking or disturbing others. The most sophisticated groups developed rotation systems for optimal positioning. If someone was naturally a warmer sleeper, they might spend the first part of the night on the outside of the group, where their heat could help establish the thermal boundary. Later in the night, as everyone's body temperature dropped during deeper sleep, they might move to the center where their heat could maintain the group's core temperature. They understood that body heat economics wasn't just about warmth, it was about sleep quality. A group that managed their thermal resources well would wake up more rested, more alert, and better able to handle the demands of another challenging day. Poor thermal management led to restless sleep, frequent waking, and the kind of fatigue that could be fatal in survival situations. Some groups even developed signaling systems for thermal adjustments. A light touch might indicate someone needed to move closer for warmth. A gentle push might signal that someone was getting overheated and needed more space. These communications happened without fully waking anyone, maintaining the group's sleep quality while ensuring everyone stayed comfortable. The thermal efficiency they achieved was remarkable. Modern thermal imaging would show these sleeping groups as single heat signatures, not individual bodies, but unified warm zones where the temperature gradients flowed smoothly from person to person. They had essentially turned themselves into human-powered heating systems that could maintain comfortable temperatures all night long, using nothing but their own metabolic energy. Weather changes were managed through group thermal responses. On the coldest nights, the formation would tighten up, with people sleeping closer together and adding extra individuals to the outer thermal boundary. On milder nights, the group could spread out more, allowing air circulation while still maintaining shared warmth. They even learned to manage the thermal transition periods, those moments when people joined or left the sleeping group. Someone getting up to tend the fire or handle a midnight emergency would do so in ways that minimized heat loss for everyone else. When they returned, the group would adjust to let them back into the thermal zone without creating cold spots or disrupting others' sleep. The psychological effects were just as important as the physical ones. Sleeping surrounded by the warmth of other people created a sense of security and comfort that went beyond just temperature regulation. The knowledge that you were part of a thermal community, that your warmth was helping others and their warmth was helping you, reinforced social bonds in the most fundamental way possible. This wasn't just survival strategy. It was the foundation of human cooperation itself. Night after night, month after month, people learned to literally trust each other with their lives through shared warmth. The person sleeping next to you wasn't just a companion. They were an essential part of your survival system. And when it worked perfectly, when the positioning was optimal and everyone's thermal needs were met, something beautiful happened. The entire group would settle into synchronized sleep patterns, breathing together, warming together, resting together as a single living organism perfectly adapted to survive the coldest nights Earth could produce. But all that shared warmth created something else, an intimacy that shaped how humans related to each other in ways that went far beyond just staying alive. Chapter 7. Breathing warm together. The night was never truly silent in a winter shelter. Listen closely, and you would hear the rise and fall of many lungs, a chorus of breathing, soft and steady, weaving through the darkness. Each exhale sent a faint cloud into the cold air, mingling with another, until the space was filled with warmth not from fire alone, but from the simple presence of bodies lying side by side. To sleep together was not a choice born of comfort, it was survival. Alone, a person could freeze, but gathered in a circle, pressed shoulder to shoulder, the human body became a furnace. Skin against skin, blanket against blanket, they built a wall against the frost, that scratched at the walls outside. In that closeness, a strange kind of trust was born. The knowledge that your warmth was not your own, but a shared gift. Children curled against mothers, elders folded into the group like treasured stones, and hunters laid down their weapons at the edge of the fire, trusting their companions to protect them as they surrendered to sleep. Each heartbeat, each sigh, was part of a quiet rhythm, a reminder that no one faced the night alone. Imagine the scene: the floor lined with hides, the air heavy with smoke, the scent of fur and earth mingling with human breath. A single log snapped in the fire and the sound echoed like a drum in the hush. Someone stirred, shifted an arm, pressed closer. Slowly, the rhythm of the group returned. In the shelter of togetherness, fear eased, muscles softened, eyes closed. The cold could not reach them here, at least not yet. But such closeness was not always simple. To share sleep was to surrender privacy. Every murmur in the night, every restless turn, every dream half-whispered became part of the group's experience. Trust was not only about warmth, it was about restraint, patience, and respect. To sleep so near another was to know them in a way no daylight conversation could reveal. You heard the patterns of their breathing, the cough they tried to hide, the way they sighed when sleep carried them away. Intimacy grew not in grand gestures, but in the smallest sounds of the night. A hand brushing against another's in the dark could spark comfort, or perhaps unease. A child's restless kick was absorbed by the warmth of a parent who would not complain. In that tight space, survival demanded tolerance. Bonds deepened quietly, unspoken, until the group itself became like one great body breathing in unison. And then there was the silence of absence. When one voice fell quiet forever, the circle felt it. The missing breath was louder than all the others. Sleep became heavier, colder. Companions would pull closer, as though trying to fill the gap. But some absences lingered like shadows. These nights taught them the fragility of life, how thin the line was between sleeping and never waking again. Still, there was beauty in this closeness. In modern times, we think of sleep as private, a solitary act behind closed doors. But for our ancestors, it was a collective ritual. Every night reinforced the truth that life was shared, warmth was shared, and survival was shared. No one truly owned their breath. It was woven into the group like threads into a blanket. Perhaps you have felt something similar, in a crowded house during a storm, or when camping, huddled together against the chill. The simple nearness of another heartbeat gives strength. It is not comfort in the luxury sense, but comfort in the human sense. The knowledge that you are not alone, that another will wake if you stir, that your life is bound with theirs. The longer the winter, the stronger this bond became. When snow buried the world outside, when nights stretched endlessly, the shared sleeping space was the heart of community. Here, whispers of stories passed between yawns. Here, laughter sometimes broke the silence. Here, tears fell unnoticed in the dark. It was a place of vulnerability, and because of that, it was also a place of truth. But there was always tension beneath the warmth. For as the group rested, dangers lurked in the blackness beyond the door. A predator's howl could slice through the night, or a storm wind could threaten to snuff out the fire. Inside, bodies pressed close for comfort, but outside, the world waited with sharp teeth and frozen breath. To survive, someone had to remain awake, and so, while the group breathed warm together, one or two would sit near the flames, eyes half closed but watchful, feeding the fire and listening for danger. The circle of warmth inside the shelter was only possible because of those who sacrificed their sleep to guard it. The bond of trust extended not only to those who slept beside you, but also to the one who promised to keep the night at bay. This balance between closeness and vigilance, between sleep and wakefulness, was the rhythm of survival. And as one generation after another pressed together to share warmth, the tradition endured. Life depended not only on the strength of the fire, but on the trust within the circle. Breathing warm together was the heartbeat of winter survival. Yet warmth alone was never enough. Fires dimmed and shadows moved. Each long night asked the same question: who will stay awake while the rest close their eyes? And with that question, we turn to the next part of their story. The quiet guardians of the night, those who bore the burden of sleeplessness so that others could dream. Chapter 8. The Night Watch. The fire was never left to chance. A single flame was as precious as food, as water, as breath itself. And so, while most lay curled in the shared warmth of the shelter, a few remained awake. They were the guardians of the night, watchers who carried the heavy weight of sleeplessness so that others could drift into dreams. Imagine sitting there, your back against the rough wall of the hut, the firelight painting orange and red on your face. Around you, the quiet chorus of breathing rises and falls, a steady lullaby. Yet your ears strain beyond that comfort, listening for the faintest sound outside, a branch snapping under hidden paws, the sigh of wind that could carry snow into the shelter. The night is a vast ocean, and you are the lone boat keeping it from flooding your people. These rotations of watchfulness were carefully arranged. Each person took their turn, for no one could endure sleepless nights forever. Some rose willingly, eager to serve, proud to be trusted with such responsibility. Others dreaded the task, fighting drowsiness as the hours dragged, but all understood its necessity. The night watch was not about bravery or fearlessness. It was about duty. The survival of the group depended on someone's eyes remaining open when the rest were closed. The fire itself demanded attention. Logs had to be fed at steady intervals. Embers stirred before they dimmed into ash. Without its warmth, the sleeping circle would grow cold quickly, breaths turning to frost, bodies shivering awake. For the watchers, every crackle of wood was a small reassurance. The shelter was alive, the night held back for another hour. And yet, it was not only the fire they guarded. Predators prowled in the darkness. Wolves, great cats, even desperate scavengers driven close by hunger. To these creatures, the scent of smoke, of food, of life was an irresistible invitation. The watchers knew this. Their hands rested close to spears, bows, or sharpened stones. Their eyes flicked off into the door, to the flickering shadows, to the places where moonlight carved pale lines across the snow. Loneliness was the hardest part. The shelter behind them was full of warmth, bodies pressed together, dreams whispering softly through the silence. But the watcher lived outside that comfort, apart for a time, carrying the burden alone. Hours stretched longer in the dark. The mind played tricks. A rustle became a predator. A shifting shadow became a figure waiting in the trees. Fatigue pulled at the eyelids, heavy as stone, and every blink carried the dangerous sweetness of surrender. Some watchers fought this with quiet rituals. They sang softly under their breath, a tune too low to wake the sleepers, but enough to steady their own mind. Others paced near the fire, rubbing hands together, drawing warmth from movement. A A few whispered to the flames themselves, as if the fire were a companion who could answer back. And still, there were moments of rare beauty. When the sky was clear, the watcher could step outside and see stars scattered like shards of ice across the heavens. Sometimes the moon painted the snow in silver light, making the world glow as if day had been reborn in pale disguise. In those moments, the watcher felt something few others did: the grandeur of the night itself, vast and eternal. But beauty did not erase danger. There were stories passed down of watchers who failed in their duty, who dozed for only a moment, only a breath, and woke to disaster. A fire gone cold, a predator already inside, an enemy's weapon cutting through the silence. These stories were told not to shame, but to remind. The night was unforgiving. It asked for vigilance, and it punished neglect. Trust in the night watch was sacred. To sleep deeply in the circle, one had to believe that someone else was awake, listening, protecting. Every person who took a turn at the fire carried not only wood and weapons, but also the unspoken faith of their companions. The children sleeping against their mothers, the elders breathing weakly in the corner, the hunters who needed rest for tomorrow's chase. All of them trusted in the watcher's eyes. This system of rotation was more than practical. It was a rhythm of community, a cycle of giving and receiving. Tonight, you kept the fire alive for me. Tomorrow, I will do the same for you. In this way, the burden was shared, and so was the strength. The night belonged not to one, but to all. Perhaps you felt something like this in your own life, when someone stayed awake to care for you, when you could rest only because you trusted another's wakefulness. The night watch reminds us that survival is never solitary. It is built on the quiet courage of those who remain alert, unseen, so that others may close their eyes. And so, the fire burned, hour after hour, as watchers came and went. Sleep and wakefulness wove together, a pattern as old as humanity. Each time a new guard rose, another lay down to join the circle, breathing warm together once more. But even with fire and watchfulness, the night carried other hungers, not only from predators, but from within the shelter itself. Stomachs growled in the dark, bodies stirred with need, and sometimes survival meant breaking sleep to answer that call. And so we turn to the next chapter, when hunger met sleep, and the bond between food and warmth shaped the long nights of survival. Chapter 9. When hunger meets sleep. Hunger has a voice. It does not whisper politely. It growls, twists, and claws from the inside, reminding a body that survival is not only about warmth and safety, but also about nourishment. In the long winters of our ancestors, sleep was never free from hunger's reach. The night was a place not only of dreams, but also of empty stomachs, of cravings that stirred even the most exhausted from rest. Picture the shelter once more. The fire glows low, embers pulsing like faint stars on the ground. Around it, bodies lie close, breathing in slow rhythm, their warmth knitting together a fragile cocoon against the cold. Yet in the stillness, one person shifts, then another. It is not danger from outside that rouses them, but a different ache, the gnawing reminder of an empty belly. Food and sleep were always bound together. To lie down hungry was to invite restless dreams, shallow rest, a night punctured by shivers and sighs. When the body lacks fuel, it steals from its own reserves, muscles trembling with weakness, bones aching with fatigue. And so, even in the darkness of winter nights, when conserving every scrap of food was vital, some would rise to eat in secret or share what little they had. Midnight meals were not indulgence. They were medicine against the cold. In many shelters, food was stored not far from where people slept. Meat hung smoked and salted near the rafters, beyond the reach of animals. Roots, grains, and dried berries were kept in sealed containers, covered with hides to protect them from frost. The scent of this stored life filled the room. Faint sweetness of dried fruit, sharp tang of smoked fish, earthy musk of roots pulled from autumn soil. For the sleepers, these smells were comfort. For the hungry, they were torture. Imagine lying there, hunger gnawing, and knowing that above your head hangs the promise of relief. Yet restraint was necessary. Food was precious, rationed carefully to last the long stretch until spring's thaw. To eat too freely in the night meant stealing not just from yourself, but from the future, from children, from the sick, from the group as a whole. The night was a test of discipline as much as endurance. Still, hunger and sleep often struck uneasy bargains. Families developed quiet rituals. A mother might tuck a small bundle of roasted grains or dried meat beside her child before bed. A comfort not only for the stomach, but for the heart. Elders whose bodies grew frail might sip warm broth before lying down, their portions small but enough to grant a deeper rest. Hunters who returned late might share a bite of their catch in the midnight hours, chewing slowly, savoring warmth that spread through their blood. And sometimes, food itself became part of the bedding. Animal hides, still rich with fat, gave off a scent that filled the air with reassurance. Aromatic herbs were scattered near sleeping places, both to mask the odors of close living and to give the illusion of fullness. Hunger is not only a physical ache, it is also a state of mind. To smell food, to taste even a little, could trick the body into believing it was satisfied, enough to drift back into fragile sleep. But not all hunger could be soothed. There were winters when stores ran low, when poor hunts left the racks bare, when famine pressed so close that every bite was counted like treasure. In those nights, the shelter was not filled with the smell of dried meat or stew, but with the silence of empty hands. People dreamed of food, woke with mouths watering, their bodies colder because the fire within them had too little fuel. In such times, hunger shaped dreams themselves. People spoke of visions of feasts, of tables laden with roasted meat, of streams flowing with fat and honey. To dream of food was bittersweet, both a cruel reminder of what the stomach lacked and a temporary balm, a moment where the mind tasted what the body could not. Storytellers would sometimes spin these hunger dreams into tales, sharing them by the fire as warnings or as strange comforts. Last night, one might say, I feasted on berries so ripe they stained my lips. Perhaps tomorrow, the forest will give us the same. Food, when it was eaten in the night, often carried ritual weight. A midnight meal was more than chewing in the dark. It was an act of survival wrapped in meaning. Families prayed quietly over shared morsels, thanking the spirits of the hunt, the animals who gave their flesh, the earth that stored roots deep below frost. In the stillness of night, a single bite became sacred. And when food was plentiful, in rare winters where the hunt was good, or when preparations were generous, midnight meals became something else entirely, moments of intimacy, of shared joy. Imagine a group waking together, hunger pulling them from sleep. Someone stirs the pot by the fire, adding fat and herbs, steam rising into the smoky air. The group gathers, bowls in hand, eating slowly, laughter whispering between them. In the middle of the longest night, they found not only sustenance but also connection. There was another reason hunger met sleep: warmth. Eating before bed kindled the inner fire. A stomach full of warm broth or Roasted fat released heat into the body, making the cold less biting, the sleep less fragile. Parents knew this and gave children food before rest, not simply to quiet their cries, but to ensure they would not wake chilled and trembling. In a world where survival hinged on warmth, food was as much a blanket as fur or flame. Yet hunger was also a teacher. It taught patience, humility, and endurance. It reminded people of limits, of the thinness of abundance, of the fragility of life itself. It bound them together, for one person's hunger was rarely suffered alone. Families felt it collectively. Communities bore it as one. To survive hunger was not only to endure individually, but to share, to sacrifice, to remind each other that no one's belly should remain empty if another's was full. And so, when hunger met sleep, it shaped not only the body, but also the spirit. Nights were longer, colder, but also deeper in meaning. Hunger taught them to value every bite, every dream, every moment of satiety. It wove food into the very act of resting, until the two became inseparable in the rhythm of winter survival. Even now, perhaps you know the feeling, trying to sleep with hunger whispering in your stomach. It is not easily ignored. Our ancestors knew it too, only magnified 1,000-fold by frost, scarcity, and the weight of survival pressing at every breath. But hunger, like cold, was something they learned to endure. They mastered not only the art of feeding their bodies, but also the art of feeding their minds, with stories, with scents, with rituals that made the night bearable. And as the night pressed on, as hunger quieted or sharpened, another sense became just as vital. For in the darkness, the body relied not only on taste and touch, but also on smell. The faintest sense that told them whether the world was safe or dangerous, whether the night carried comfort or threat. Thus, the story carries us into the next chapter, where the very air of the shelter, the smoke, the herbs, the hides, became a shield of the spirit. It was the scent of safety that guided their rest. Chapter 10. The Scent of Safety. The night had its own perfume. Step inside the winter shelter and the air itself seemed alive, a tapestry woven of smoke, sweat, fur, and earth. To modern senses, it might seem heavy, too dense, but to those who slept within, these smells were anchors of comfort. They were signals that life was present, that warmth endured, that the night was being held back by more than fire alone. At the center was always smoke. It clung to hides, hair, and skin. The fire's breath filled every corner, seeping into cloth and wood until everything carried its memory. Smoke was more than scent. It was a barrier. It masked the human presence from prowling predators, confused their noses with sharp, bitter layers. It kept insects at bay, preserved food, dried wet clothes, and coated the lungs with the familiarity of survival. To wake in the night and smell smoke was to know you were still within the circle of safety. Alongside smoke were the scents of stored life, dried meat, berries, and roots bundled in corners. These smells spoke of preparation, of foresight, of survival stretching beyond the immediate night. A faint sweetness of fruit, the sharp tang of smoked fish, the earthy musk of tubers pulled from the soil, all combined to remind sleepers that hunger could still be eased, that tomorrow still had promise. Even when stomachs grumbled, the air carried reassurance that food was near, that effort and memory had secured the winter's stores. Animal hides carried their own presence. The musky richness of fur, the faint traces of wildness clinging to skins, gave the shelter a grounded, primal odor. To lie down against such bedding was to be cradled by the memory of the hunt, by the animal's gift of warmth. The scent reminded people that they had mastered the cold in small ways, that their spears and traps had brought life into the shelter. These hides carried not only warmth, but pride, safety stitched into every fiber of their smell. And then there were the herbs, sprigs of sage, pine, juniper, and wild mint scattered in corners or laid across bedding. These were not decorations, but protections. Their fragrance masked less pleasant odors of close living. They calmed minds, cleared airways, and carried whispers of the earth even when snow buried the ground. Inhaling their sharp, clean presence was to breathe a memory of summer, a reminder that warmth would return. Children fell asleep with these scents in their nostrils, their dreams colored by the sweetness of herbs against the harshness of winter air. But perhaps the most powerful scent of all was the human one: sweat, skin, breath, and hair mingling in the shared air. To the people of the shelter, this was not unpleasant. It was familiarity, belonging, proof of community. To inhale the scent of one's family, one's people, was to inhale safety itself. In the darkness, when eyes were closed, the nose reminded the body, you are not alone. You are surrounded by your kind. This was the perfume of survival, raw, honest, unmistakable. Smell is a strange companion to memory. Even now, you may have noticed how a single scent can pull you backward in time. The smell of wood smoke, perhaps, carrying you to childhood fires. The scent of old leather reminding you of a parent's chair. The fragrance of herbs stirring a memory of kitchens long gone. For our ancestors, smell was not only memory, but also present truth. It told them if the fire was alive, if food was safe, if danger lingered. The nose was as much a guardian as the eyes and ears. Predators, too, had their scents. Wolves left musk on the wind. Bears carried the heavy odor of fat and fur. Strangers brought foreign traces of soil and wood. To smell these things in the night was to wake instantly, the heart pounding. But to smell only the familiar, only the smoke and hides and herbs, was to fall back into rest with a calmer spirit. There is a comfort in knowing what the air tells you. In modern rooms, sealed and sterile, we forget this intimacy. But in those shelters, scent was as crucial as warmth. People slept with their noses attuned, unconsciously registering the world through smell. A sudden shift in odor, the acrid tang of fire too low, the stench of rot in stored food, the rank trace of an animal too close, was enough to jolt someone awake. The scent of safety was also the scent of belonging. A child pressed against its mother's breast inhaled not only milk, but also the unique warmth of her skin. A hunter resting beside his companions smelled the mixture of sweat, leather, and smoke that marked his brothers in arms. Elders, frail and wrapped in hides, drifted into dreams surrounded by the accumulated smells of generations, smoke from fires long past, herbs gathered by hands now gone, animal hides that once roamed forests never to be seen again. Perhaps you can imagine it, lying in the dark, the world outside howling with wind and cold, and the air around you thick with scents that speak of survival. Each inhale becomes reassurance, each breath a tether holding you to the group, to life. It was not silence alone that gave comfort, but the air itself, soaked in signals that whispered, "You are safe here. You are part of something enduring." And so, as people drifted into dreams, guided by hunger or soothed by warmth, the very air around them cradled their minds. Smell shaped their rest, calmed their fears, anchored their dreams. The nose, though unseen, stood watch with the fire, reminding them through the smallest details that the shelter still held. Yet in that sleep, carried by sense and warmth, Another mystery awaited. Dreams were not simply private wanderings. They were shared stories, cultural treasures, visions shaped by hunger, fear, hope, and memory. As the body rested, the mind wandered into landscapes of ice and fire, beasts and ancestors. And so, we move into the next part of their story, the dreams that rose within the ice, and how a night's sleep became a place of cultural survival as much as physical. Chapter 11, Dreams in the Ice. The body might have been trapped in winter, wrapped in hides and smoke, but the mind wandered freely. As sleep descended, the long nights of cold turned into landscapes of visions. Dreams were not an escape. They were a second world, as real in meaning as the waking one. Picture the shelter, the fire glowing faintly, the air thick with smoke and herbs, the rhythm of breathing steady all around. Eyes close, hunger hums, cold presses in, but the mind begins its wandering. In the stillness of the night, dreams carried people across ice fields, into forests alive with spirits, toward ancestors whose voices lingered just beyond waking. For our ancestors, dreams were not dismissed as illusions. They were woven into the very fabric of survival. A dream could be guidance, a warning, a message from something greater. Hunters dreamed of deer running through the snow, and when they woke, they looked for tracks with renewed faith. Mothers dreamed of warm fields and flowers, carrying the hope of spring into their waking hearts. Elders dreamed of those who had passed before, and their words were treated as counsel for the living. In the long nights of winter, when the world outside was frozen and still, stories took root in dreams. One person would wake and share what they had seen: a wolf standing guard, a river thawing, a fire that would not die. The group listened closely, weighing every detail. Dreams were maps of meaning, shaped by hunger, by cold, by memory. Sometimes dreams soothed. They offered feasts to the hungry, warmth to the shivering, light to those who had stared too long into the dark. At other times, they unsettled. Visions of danger, of spirits restless, of shadows that crossed the snow. These dreams stirred fear, but also prepared the mind for what might come. To dream was to rehearse survival. The children were the most vivid dreamers. Their young minds, untamed by discipline, painted the night with strange colors. They woke speaking of animals that talked, of trees that sang, of ancestors with glowing eyes. The adults did not laugh. They listened, for they believed children were closest to the spirit world, their dreams pure messages not yet filtered by reason. Dreams also held the memory of culture. Stories passed down in waking hours returned in the night, reshaped by imagination. A tale told by the fire became a living vision in sleep, vivid and breathing. In this way, culture survived not only by words, but by dreams themselves. The people awoke already carrying their stories inside them, reinforced by the private theater of the night. There was a rhythm to these winter dreams. Hunger shaped them, pulling visions of food, feasts, and plenty. The cold shaped them, summoning fires that never died, and shelters warm beyond measure. Fear shaped them, filling them with predators lurking at the edge of light. And yet, always dreams ended with survival, a sign that the mind, even in its wandering, clung to hope. The dream world was not separate from the sleeping space. It was part of it. One person stirred, muttering in sleep, and another heard the fragments of their vision. A child whimpered, whispering of wolves, and a mother soothed them, carrying the warning into her waking thoughts. Dreams passed between sleepers, spoken aloud, caught by others. In this way, they became shared, collective. Perhaps you have felt this, waking from a dream that lingers, too real to dismiss, carrying it with you into your day. For our ancestors, this was not strange. It was expected. Dreams were woven into their lives as surely as fire and food. And so, the long nights were not only about warmth and hunger, they were also about dreams. Dreams that gave meaning, comfort, and warning. They preserved memory, carried culture, and offered glimpses into a world beyond the ice. But even dreams could not silence danger. For there were nights when sleep itself had to be broken, when predators came close, when the world outside intruded with sharp teeth and sudden terror. Safety was fragile, and the watchers sometimes had to wake everyone at once. And so we turn now to those nights when danger came calling, when sleep was torn apart, and survival depended on waking in an instant. Chapter 12. When danger came calling. Danger did not always announce itself with roaring sound. Sometimes it crept softly, the faint crunch of snow, the whisper of claws against wood, the low growl barely carried by the wind. Inside the shelter, people lay breathing together, unaware. But danger could not be ignored for long. The predators of winter were desperate too. Wolves prowled in packs, eyes glowing in the moonlight, following the scent of smoke and food. Bears, restless even in their dens, sometimes wandered close. Big cats stalked the shadows, silent as falling snow. For these creatures, a human shelter was both threat and opportunity, warmth, food, and flesh within reach. When danger came, the night transformed. One sharp sound was enough. A watcher stirred, tense. A mother woke, clutching her child closer. A hunter's hand slid quietly to his spear. The circle of warmth broke into alertness, the comfort of breathing together replaced by pounding hearts. There were protocols, unspoken but practiced. The strongest moved first, positioning themselves near the door. Children were pulled deeper into the shelter. Elders were shielded by younger bodies. Weapons were lifted silently, shadows dancing on the walls in the flicker of firelight. Even in panic, there was order. Survival demanded it. The fire became both shield and danger. Its light drove predators back, but its glow also revealed the shelter's presence. Watchers tended it carefully, making it flare at the right moment, dim at others. Smoke was fanned toward the door, its bitter bite another line of defense. Sometimes danger came from within. Illness could spread quickly in such close quarters, and the sudden fever of one could endanger all. A cough in the night drew uneasy looks, silent fears. Was it only the smoke, or something worse? Danger was not always claw and fang. It was also the frailty of the body, the weakness of flesh. But the greatest threat was always suddenness. To be woken from warmth into fight was jarring, disorienting. The transition from dream to survival was a test of the mind. Those who could master it, waking swiftly, reacting calmly, became leaders in those moments. Their steadiness calmed others. Their movements gave order to chaos. There were nights when the danger passed quickly. A wolf sniffing, pacing, then moving on. Other nights became battles. Stories tell of shelters surrounded, of fires kept alive through sheer will, of hunters striking with spears while women and children fed flames higher and higher. These moments became legend, retold in whispers, reminders of both terror and resilience. Yet, once the danger passed, the shelter returned to silence. The breathing resumed, though slower now, edged with tension. Sleep did not come easily after such nights. Dreams were haunted by teeth and shadows, but eventually, exhaustion overcame fear. The circle closed again, fragile but enduring. Perhaps you know this feeling. waking suddenly in the night, heart racing, convinced of some threat. Our ancestors lived with that truth daily, their sleep always balanced on the edge of alertness. Danger was never far, even in rest. But danger also taught them resilience. They learned to trust their watchers, to rely on protocols, to wake swiftly and respond as one. Their nights were never entirely safe, but they were never helpless either. And in the aftermath of danger, another role of sleep emerged: healing. For bodies weakened by fear, wounds, or sickness, the shelter became not just a place of rest, but a place of care. Now we turn to that chapter: how winter shelters became hospitals, how rest was medicine, and how the group cared for its frail and wounded through the long, unforgiving night. Chapter 13. The Healing Sleep. The shelter at night was more than a place of rest. It was the hospital, the sanctuary, the quiet place where bodies were mended and spirits soothed. In the depth of winter, when the outside world froze to silence and danger pressed close from every direction, there was no place else for the wounded to turn. Healing had to happen here, in the warmth of shared breath, in the press of bodies, in the fragile peace of sleep. Picture the circle. The fire glows low, its light brushing soft orange across hides pinned to the walls. Smoke curls upward, heavy and thick. But to the people, it is not an irritation. It is comfort. It is protection. It is the familiar air of survival. Around the fire, men, women, and children are curled tightly together. Some sleep deeply, others shift, turning, seeking comfort in the closeness. At the very center, though, there is one who does not move easily. A hunter, perhaps, with a leg wound bound in cloth. Or a child, their forehead damp with fever. Their breath is shallow, labored, but it is steady only because of the care wrapped around them. The healthy arrange themselves to give their warmth to the weak. A man presses against the hunter's side to share his heat. A mother lies with her feverish child's head against her chest, her own body shaking with exhaustion, but she will not move. They all know that healing cannot happen in the cold, cannot happen in solitude. The body repairs itself in stillness, in warmth, in the strange sanctuary of dreams. They did not have words like immune system or circulation, yet they knew. They watched how wounds closed more quickly when the injured were allowed to rest undisturbed. They saw how a fever eased when the sick one was kept warm and wrapped in sleep. They knew that sleep was more than a nightly escape. It was the healer, the great medicine given freely to all, and so they protected it fiercely. The sick were lulled into slumber with soft songs. The injured were given broth before bed, fat and marrow to kindle the inner fire that kept them from shaking. Elders were cushioned with the softest hides, placed where the smoke was gentle, where they could sleep without the draft biting at their bones. Herbs played their part. Pine needles boiled in water, their steam filling the air with sharpness that cleared clogged chests. Sage burned to drive away bad spirits and, perhaps more importantly, to ease breathing in the heavy air. Juniper smoked in the corners, its resinous scent said to carry sickness away. Mint and wild thyme were tucked beneath bedding, their fragrance rising in the night to calm nausea, to soothe headaches. Whether by magic or by medicine, these practices made the shelter a place of healing. But the greatest healer was not herb or smoke. It was touch. The hand that pressed against a wound to stop its bleeding. The arm that held the feverish child until the shaking eased. The body that curved around another to share heat through the long night. Touch was medicine, comfort, and hope. To be touched was to know you were not alone in your suffering. To reach out was to remind another that their pain was carried by the group. Some nights, healing was a victory. The fever broke by dawn. The wounded hunter woke stronger. The cough grew quiet. Relief spread through the shelter, silent but palpable, like warmth spreading from the fire. Other nights, the shelter became a place of last sleep. An elder, frail and fading, breathed slower and slower until their chest no longer rose. The others knew before anyone spoke. They pulled the body closer, wrapping it in warmth, not to save, but to ease the journey. Death was not lonely in the shelter. It came surrounded by touch, by the smells of smoke and hides, by the murmur of voices, by the rhythm of breath. Death in those nights was simply the longest sleep. Children learned in these moments too. They saw their mothers soothe the sick, their fathers tend the fire for the weak, their elders murmur songs of comfort. They saw that healing was not a task for one, but for all. Survival meant carrying the frail, the wounded, the ill, just as much as carrying firewood or meat from the hunt. Perhaps you know this feeling. The comfort of someone sitting at your bedside when you are unwell. The reassurance of falling asleep to the sound of another's breathing nearby. Our ancestors knew it every night. They did not sleep apart. They did not leave the sick in separate chambers. They slept together, healed together, endured together. Healing sleep was not always peaceful. Sometimes the sick moaned in the night, restless, disturbing the rhythm of the group's breathing. Yet no one complained. They knew that such sounds meant life still clung to the body, that breath still carried on. Sometimes the injured thrashed in fevered dreams, and it took many hands to hold them steady. Sometimes the coughing of one kept others awake, but patience prevailed, because to survive meant to sacrifice rest for the healing of another. This patience was also rooted in belief. Many saw sickness not just as a failing of the body, but as the touch of unseen forces. To heal meant to drive those forces away. Prayers were whispered over the sleeping, songs sung to ward off restless spirits. Dreams were watched carefully. A sick child who dreamed of running in fields might be believed to recover, while a hunter dreaming of endless snow was feared to fade. Sleep itself was the battlefield where sickness and health contended, and the group watched over it with reverence. Still, healing was fragile. In the closeness of the shelter, sickness spread quickly. One child coughing might mean 2 by morning, 3 by nightfall. Food was limited. Herbs not always enough. There were times when entire groups grew weak, when the circle of breath sounded more like wheezing than steady rhythm. Yet even then, they leaned into one another. If they were to fail, they would fail together. If they were to survive, it would be through the shared strength of bodies and the shared medicine of sleep. The shelter in those moments was not quiet. It was filled with sounds of care. The scrape of bowls as broth was given to the sick, the rustle of hides adjusted to wrap a weak body tighter, the murmurs of encouragement whispered into half-conscious ears. Healing was not a dramatic event. It was countless small acts performed in the rhythm of night, repeated until recovery came, or until it did not. And through it all, sleep was the thread. The sick slipped in and out of it, each return a chance for the body to fight anew. The caregivers longed for it, catching moments of rest between tending. The healthy guarded it, knowing that without deep sleep, even the strong would soon grow weak. Sleep was the healer, the refuge, the quiet battle fought in every body. When morning came, the shelter often felt different. The sick stirred more easily, or they lay still in silence. The group rose with either relief or grief, but always with the knowledge that healing had been attempted with all they had. The shelter had held them, warmed them, soothed them. It had been their hospital as much as their home. Healing sleep, then, was more than an act of the body. It was an act of community, of compassion, of endurance. In those long winters, no one healed alone. No one suffered in solitude. And in that truth lies perhaps the oldest form of medicine humanity has ever known: the willingness to sleep beside another in their pain, to share breath, warmth, and dreams until the body mended or released its final sigh. And after the healing came touch, the comfort, the reassurance, the unspoken language that turned darkness into safety, that turned silence into love. Chapter 14. Touch in the dark. The shelter at night was heavy with silence, but silence was not emptiness. In the dark, when words dissolved into smoke and breath, touch became the language of life. It was not luxury, not choice, but necessity. In a world where fire could dim, where hunger gnawed, where predators lurked just beyond the thin wall of hides, the skin against skin of another body was the only guarantee that you were still alive, still not alone. Touch in the dark was everywhere. A child pressed into their mother's chest, small fingers gripping cloth or hair. The mother's hand rubbed slow circles across the child's back, lulling them into a sleep deeper than any words could give. A hunter, weary from the cold, let his shoulder fall against a companion's arm, the silent contact saying, "We survived today. We will survive tonight too." Lovers reached for each other in the dark, but so did friends, so did elders, so did children. The circle of sleep was stitched together not only with warmth, but with hands, with weight, with closeness. Think of it. In modern nights, we lie in solitude, rooms quiet except for our own breath. But in the shelters of winter, no one slept without another's body pressing close. This was not suffocating. It was life itself. In the press of touch, fears eased, tremors calmed, dreams softened. The body does not lie. When we are held, the heart slows, the mind releases its grip on fear, and the night feels less vast. Touch carried messages the mouth could not. Anger spoken in daylight, harsh words exchanged, softened when those same people lay pressed together at night. A quarrel between brothers, sharp and cutting, melted into the quiet reassurance of a hand brushing against an arm in sleep. Forgiveness did not need to be spoken. It was given through the willingness to remain close, to share warmth still. In this way, touch did what words could not. It healed rifts. It soothed wounds invisible to the eye. There were times when touch meant vigilance. A watcher, sitting by the fire, would nudge the sleeper beside them gently when it was time to take their turn. A shift in position, an arm pressing lightly against another's chest, was a warning that something outside was stirring. The body itself became an alarm system, touch rippling through the circle without sound. In the dark, you did not always need eyes or voices. A squeeze of the arm, a shake of the shoulder, a firm grip pulling someone close. These were the signals that kept the group alive. But not all touch was born of fear. Much of it was tenderness. When the sick moaned in the dark, hands reached instinctively, laying against the forehead, wiping sweat, lifting a weak body against the chest. Elders, fragile and trembling, were held like children, wrapped in the embrace of the younger. Even death was softened by touch. The dying never left alone, always held until their last breath. The shelter was filled with these small gestures, repeated endlessly. Hands stroking hair, fingers entwined, arms wrapped around shoulders, feet pressed against legs, heads resting against chests. These were not deliberate choices, but reflexes as natural as breathing. Humans are animals of touch, and in the harshness of winter, they remembered this truth with every passing night. There was also joy in touch. Children rolling together in their sleep, tangled in laughter even as they dreamed. Lovers finding each other beneath hides, their touches both secret and obvious, part of the rhythm of the circle. Friends clasping hands before rest, a ritual of trust. Even in hunger, even in sickness, touch carried play, carried hope, carried the sweetness of being alive together. Touch was teaching too. Children learned the language of their people through it. They knew by instinct that a hand on the shoulder meant calm, that a squeeze of fingers meant reassurance, that a body pressed close meant protection. Long before they understood words, they understood touch. It was the first education in survival and the most enduring. Perhaps you know this yourself. Perhaps you have felt the peace of someone reaching for your hand in the night, the calm of a loved one's arm pulling you close during a storm. Our ancestors lived in this constant embrace, night after night, their survival woven into the tapestry of contact. Touch was not an extra. It was the thread that held the group together when the world outside threatened to unravel them. And yet, touch did more than connect one body to another. It connected them to the world beyond the shelter. Through skin, through ears, through breath, they learned to read the night itself, to feel its warnings, to sense its promises, to listen with their whole being. Touch was the gateway not only to intimacy, but to awareness. And so, from the silence of hands and arms in the dark, we move into the greater silence beyond the walls, the language of the night itself, a language of wind, snow, animals, and whispers that only those who listened with patience could truly hear. Chapter 15, Reading the Night. The night was never silent. To the untrained ear, perhaps it seemed so. A blanket of darkness, a pause between days. But for those who lived by survival, who lay in shelters of hides and wood through endless winters, the night was alive with voices. To live was to listen. To rest was never to close oneself fully. Sleep came, yes, but it came with one ear open, with the skin alert, with the nose and breath searching for clues. To survive, you had to read the night. Imagine lying there, your body pressed among others, firelight faint on your eyelids. Dreams begin to pull you downward, but even in the half-silence you hear it. The fires crackle, sharp and clear. That sound is comfort. It tells you the fire is alive, that warmth still holds. But if the crackle fades, replaced by only the hiss of dying embers, your body knows it before your mind does. Danger, cold approaching, the need to feed the flame. Every sound in the shelter carried a message. The breath of those beside you told you if they were calm or fevered. The shifting of bodies meant someone was cold, or restless, or afraid. The shelter itself spoke, wood creaking under frost, hides snapping as wind pressed against them, snow sliding off the roof with a muffled groan. The people did not ignore these sounds. They slept with them, through them, reading them in the way one reads the pulse of a heartbeat. Outside, the world carried its own language. The wolves sang first. Their howls rolled across the frozen ground, long and layered. A distant howl was a lullaby, reminding you that danger was far. A close howl was a summons to alertness. When wolves circled, their calls came shorter, sharper, echoing back and forth like drum beats. The sleepers knew this. Even in dreams, the mind translated the wolves' chorus into meaning. How many? How close? How soon? The wind, too, was a voice. In winter, it was a constant companion, but it did not speak in one tone. When it roared high and wild, rattling the walls of the shelter. It warned of storms. When it hissed low through cracks, it meant snow was drifting, piling high. When it fell still, suddenly, unnaturally, sleepers stirred uneasily. For silence often meant the weight of a blizzard gathering in the dark sky. Children were taught to notice these things, to listen not only with ears, but with bones. They learned that the night spoke through the smallest changes, that survival was about paying attention to whispers as much as to shouts. Animals other than wolves gave their voices too. The cry of an owl pierced the darkness, a sharp warning. The rustle of branches in the forest meant deer passing, their hooves leaving signs in the snow that would feed the hunters at dawn. The sudden silence of birds, of crickets, of small life. That silence was its own message, often louder than any call. It meant something larger had come. A predator, perhaps, or a stranger. And then there were the scents of night. Sleep did not close the nose. The smell of smoke reassured. The fire was still breathing, but too much smoke meant danger of suffocation, and the sleepers stirred, coughing, waking to open vents. The musk of wolves, or the sharp stink of bear on the wind, was enough to send a ripple of unease through the shelter. Food, too, spoke through smell. The tang of spoiled meat, the sourness of rot warned of illness. The air was not mute, it was full of signs, and those signs were life itself. To read the night was to live in a state between worlds, not fully awake, not fully asleep. The body rested, but the senses remained open, stretched into the dark. Children grew up within this awareness. They learned to identify the different pitches of wind, the layers of wolf howls, the crackle that meant fire thriving, and the hiss that meant fire failing. These were not skills to be studied once, but lessons pressed into the body over years until instinct carried them. Stories reinforced it. Elders told of the time a watcher misread the silence, and wolves came close enough to scrape claws on the shelter's door. They told of a man who woke because he smelled something strange, the faint musk of smoke from another camp, and that awareness saved them from raiders. These stories were more than warnings, they were training. They taught the young that the night was never empty, never harmless. It had to be read carefully, as one reads a map. Perhaps you have felt it yourself, lying awake at night, sensing something wrong even before you know why. The silence feels too sharp, the house too still, and your body reacts before your mind. This is the old instinct. It is the echo of those winters, those shelters, those long nights when listening meant survival. But reading the night was not only fear, it was also beauty. To step outside in the stillness, to see stars glittering like ice shards, to hear the wind sing through frozen trees, was to feel the grandeur of the world. Watchers sometimes spoke of moments when the night felt alive, when the sky itself seemed to whisper. They returned to the shelter with eyes shining, carrying not fear, but awe. For the night was not only danger, it was also teacher, also mystery, also wonder. And so the people rested in this balance, half in dream, half in awareness, reading the night even as they drifted into sleep. It was a skill, a culture, a rhythm of survival. But perhaps the deepest lessons of the night were not heard by hunters or elders, but absorbed by children, those who lay closest to the fire, listening with small ears, carrying forward the wisdom of generations. Their circle was the heart of survival, the place where the future itself was trained in the art of resting with awareness. Chapter 16, The Children's Circle. The winter shelter was always alive with sound, with breath, with the soft shifting of bodies in the dark. But at the very heart of this circle, there was always a smaller circle, the children. They were not only the most fragile, but also the most important. Every hunter, every mother, every elder knew this truth. The future lay curled up in the warmth of small bodies, in the rise and fall of young lungs, in the dreams of those not yet hardened by the world. The children's circle was more than survival. It was promise. Imagine the way they slept. Infants pressed tightly against mothers' chests, lulled by the rhythm of a heartbeat more ancient than words. Toddlers nestled between parents, their hands grasping hides or hair even in dreams, refusing to let go of the tether of safety. Older children huddled together, whispering stories before sleep, their laughter softening into breath as drowsiness overtook them. Each child was surrounded by warmth, not only from the fire, but from the human walls of parents, siblings, kin, and community. Children learned the meaning of survival not through lectures, but through the silent lessons of night. The warmth of skin taught them that life was shared. The rationed food before sleep taught them that survival depended on balance, that one's portion was always tied to another's. The touch of hands on their shoulders, soothing their cries, taught them that fear was met not with isolation, but with closeness. They learned these truths not in daylight instruction, but in the softness of the dark, in the rhythm of breathing all around them. Stories shaped them. Before bed, elders whispered tales of ancestors who braved long nights, of animals who spoke in dreams, of stars that guided hunters through frozen forests. These stories slid easily into sleep, blending with dreams, shaping their imagination. A child might wake in the morning with eyes wide, declaring they had dreamed of running with deer, of standing by the fire of ancestors long gone. These dreams were not dismissed. They were listened to carefully, treated as messages. The children learned that dreams were not foolish, but part of the great fabric of survival. The children's circle was also the training ground. Though their bodies were weak, their senses were sharpened early. They were told to listen to the fire, to notice when its voice changed. They were told to listen to the wolves, to count the number of howls, to feel the difference between distant and near. They were asked to carry small tasks even before sleep, feeding herbs into the fire, checking the hides at the door, learning to pull their blankets tight to conserve heat. These duties were not burdens, they were lessons. A child who stumbled now would, one day, stand steady when the group needed them. And yet, childhood was not only training, it was joy too, even in the long night. Children played games even as they drifted into sleep, poking each other under hides, whispering riddles in the dark, giggling until parents hushed them. Their joy lifted the shelter, softened the hard edges of hunger and fear. A single child's laugh could ripple through the circle like light, reminding everyone why the struggle was endured. The group treated all children as their own. A mother's arms might cradle another's infant if her own were asleep. Fathers and uncles drew children close, teaching them by example what strength looked like. Elders told them stories, sang to them, stroked their hair until they closed their eyes. In this way, the children's circle was not only nuclear families, but the entire community woven together. Every child carried the love of many hands, many voices, many hearts. There were dangers too. Children were vulnerable to cold, to hunger, to sickness. Fevers came quickly. Coughs spread easily. The shelter in these moments was tense as the circle tightened around the fragile bodies, wrapping them in warmth, whispering prayers. watching their every breath. A single child's illness became everyone's concern. In the long nights, the group learned that the health of the weakest was the measure of all. Perhaps you remember your own childhood nights, falling asleep to the sound of a parent's voice, or the warmth of another body beside you. Our ancestors lived this truth without walls or beds or privacy. Children were raised in the collective arms of the community, shaped by the closeness of the sleeping circle. They learned survival not as knowledge, but as intimacy, as touch, as warmth, as the rhythm of night itself. The children's circle was more than a place of rest. It was a classroom, a temple, a forge where the next generation was shaped. Their laughter, their dreams, their small duties were threads woven into the fabric of survival. Without them, the nights would have been colder, the fire dimmer, the future uncertain. And so, as winter stretched on, as snow pressed against the walls, the children's circle glowed at the center. The smallest bodies carried the greatest weight, not of work, but of meaning. They were the reason for vigilance, for sacrifice, for enduring hunger, for sharing warmth. But the long night always ended. The snow melted. Streams broke free of ice. The air grew softer, filled with birdsong. And when winter finally broke, the children were the first to run into the thaw, their voices carrying joy into the new season. They stepped into spring carrying the lessons of the night within them, lessons that would guide them into adulthood, lessons they would pass on to their own children in winters yet to come. The circle broke open, the shelter was left behind, and with it came the strange transition from darkness to light, from confinement to freedom, from winter's stillness to the restless movement of spring. Chapter 17. When winter breaks. The first drip of melting snow was like music. The earth began to soften, water running in thin rivulets across the frozen ground. Birds returned, their calls piercing the silence of winter. Inside the shelter, people stirred differently now. Their rest was lighter, their dreams filled with movement. Leaving the shelter was bittersweet. It had been their cocoon, their shield, their womb of warmth through endless nights. Within its walls, they had survived hunger, danger, sickness, and fear. To step out was to leave safety behind, yet it was also freedom. The cold loosened its grip, and with it came new life. The sleeping arrangements changed. No longer pressed shoulder to shoulder, families stretched out, sleeping under open skies, feeling air not heavy with smoke but fresh with spring. Children laughed at the strangeness of space, at the sound of birdsong through their dreams. Hunters rose earlier, energized by the promise of game returning to the land. Yet there was always a pause, a last look at the shelter before leaving it behind. The walls, dark with smoke, the hides worn thin, the floor stamped with months of footsteps. It was both a grave of winter and a monument to survival. They left it, but they carried its memory. And as they moved forward, they carried something else too. The lessons of the long night. How to breathe warm together, how to keep watch, how to balance hunger and rest, how to trust touch, read the night, care for the weak, protect the children. These lessons did not melt with the snow. They walked into spring with them. But perhaps the most enduring lesson of all was not felt until much later, when modern science began to study sleep, to peer into the brain, to ask questions about rest. Only then did we begin to understand what our ancestors knew instinctively, that the way they slept was not primitive, but profoundly human. Chapter 18. Legacy of the Long Night. Today, we sleep in beds, behind doors, wrapped in blankets that never freeze. We have forgotten the taste of hunger in the night, the press of bodies for warmth, the whisper of predators outside. And yet, modern science tells us something remarkable. Much of what our ancestors practiced in those shelters was deeply aligned with how the human body is meant to rest. We know now that sleeping close together regulates body heat, synchronizes heartbeats, and even steadies breathing. The circle of warmth was not only comfort, but biology, bodies protecting one another, even in sleep. We know that vigilance at night, the light sleep broken by awareness, is natural. Our brains evolved to rest in cycles, alert to danger, tuned to sound and smell. What we call restless sleep today may once have been the very thing that kept us alive. We know that dreams carry memory and meaning, that they shape the mind, rehearse survival, and preserve culture. Our ancestors were right to listen to them, to treat them as teachers. We know that touch in sleep, the brush of a hand, the press of a body, calms the nervous system, reduces fear, strengthens bonds. What they practiced in necessity, we now see as profound medicine for the soul. In our separate rooms, in our solitary beds, we have gained comfort, but lost connection. We no longer breathe in rhythm with others at night, no longer listen to the night as if it speaks, no longer fall asleep surrounded by the sense of life and survival. We have traded community for privacy, safety for solitude, but the memory remains. In moments of storm, when families gather close, when a child creeps into a parent's bed, when campers huddle by the fire, we return briefly to that ancient way. The long night still lives in us, in the way we dream, in the way we reach for another in the dark, in the way our bodies respond to touch, scent, and warmth. The legacy of the long night is not only about survival, it is about what it means to be human, to rest together, to share breath, to endure as one. And though we may no longer face winters as they did, we carry their wisdom in our bones. Every time we close our eyes, we return, in some small way, to that shelter, breathing warm together, listening to the night, dreaming in the ice, carrying forward the unbroken chain of life through the darkness into dawn.